Hi, it's Chris Leach here, the writer and designer of Control to Catastrophe Caesar. I just wanted to go through and do kind of a leaf through of the book, hopefully in a really brief way. I will talk about a few of the mechanics, some of the sort of the special features of the book, but generally speaking, just to sort of show you the book and its presentation style. So here we have the book that you get from Wargame Vault. It is a glossy cover production. I gotta say, I'm very pleased actually with the way that the Wargame Vault prints these books. So as I say, glossy cover. There's obviously the inside cover and the layout. Wanted to start just very briefly with the acknowledgments. I gotta say, a book like this, in fact, any rule set, ultimately, just like in writing history, for example, it is sort of the final word of the historian or the designer in terms of what ends up in the book. You need I think, a really focused individual effort to produce a cohesive game. But that said, it does not happen in isolation. There's no question that you need groups of gamers to help you through this process, through play testing, through raising issues that you just simply can't sort of encounter playing solo games, for example. So there's lots of people who were involved in this, in the development of this book, both my group, the White Rock Gamers, but also groups and individuals literally around the world, especially in the United States, other parts of Canada, the UK, Australia, even in Italy. So I've got to give a nod to all the people who were involved in this process and my wife who put up with this process as well. So really important. And the final thing I want to say, especially given this is a leaf through the book, is the work done by Michael Millsy in Australia. Also individuals in Australia who helped out with the book, but Michael particularly. Millsy did a great job of the layout. He also did the layout for To the Strongest, and I think his work sort of speaks for itself. So acknowledgements and the layout. Table of contents, I've decided to use that numerical system for sections and subsections. I think it works. I think it makes finding cross-references easier. So that's the approach I've used. There's a table of contents for the diagrams. There is also a brief index in the back of the book. As you would expect for any rule set, the book has obviously an opening section that deals with sort of basic concepts. You can see from the layout that I have sort of highlight boxes, again, the sections and the section numbers. And it's also a book that has color photography in it. I'm an avid photographer, and although the inside pages are matte, which is something I wanted, I like reading on matte paper better. The photographs, of course, probably would have benefited from being on glossy paper, but in fact, I'm really impressed actually by the print quality of the images. So there's a little bit of eye candy. I gotta say that generally speaking, the images in the book are illustrative, so I chose to include photographs that somehow show concepts in the book. There is not an excess of images, but certainly there are images. And occasionally, if they are eye candy, it's because there was a sort of a layout possibility where, there was room or there was just a little excess space for an image. But as I say, most of the images are in fact illustrative. So as I say, the opening section is about getting you into the game, establishing constructs like, what is a unit? How is it composed? What are the attributes of the units? So this is what's in the book in terms of that opening section. Moving on, we have obviously a very important section is you've got your units, you've perhaps pulled together an army. How do you organize it? And this is, of course, the sort of command and control element. And this is where you have, again, true of a lot of games, brigades, groups of units that operate together. In Control to Catastrophe, it can actually be even just one unit can act as its own brigade, but that usually means that other units have to be clustered in larger brigades to account for that sort of limitation of command and control. Image here shows you that that you need actually numerous brigadiers. Many armies will have 4, 5, 6 brigades, each with its own brigade general, plus a commander. I really like the fact that you do need quite a number of commanders because, frankly, commanders are opportunities to model really nice command stands. So here's an image of some Byzantine commanders that I painted up and have based for the game. Again, deployment rules, with some diagrams. There's a good number of diagrams, once again, showing some restraint. I didn't want to overpopulate the text with diagrams, but diagrams and photographs can be obviously very useful in terms of imparting aspects of the game rules. There's a couple of different deployment options. One is more efficient than the other, but I think both get you onto the table fairly quickly. The core rules. Just a brief statement about the core rules, just in terms of how they're sort of presented. The core rules are, just as it's indicated, sort of the basic structures that you need in order to play the game. So, the moving, the shooting, and the melee aspects of the game, and of course the embedded morale aspects as well. I won't go into many of those details at all in this presentation, but what is important is that the core rules are not necessarily inclusive of special rules for special kinds of units. That's at the back of the book. And the reason for that is that Control to Catastrophe is a family of rules. And I wanted the core rules to be fairly generic in terms of, how they're presented. Each of the books, so this is the first book, of course, covering ancient and medieval warfare. There was another book that's coming out hopefully this year that covers what is commonly referred to as Renaissance or early modern warfare, basically do about 1650 to 1690. I haven't decided yet how late I want to push that book. Basically the era of pike and shot. And then there'll be a third book that covers effectively 18th century warfare. All of these periods I see as having that commonality of battlefield experience, linear warfare, armies deploying in face of one another. And I think that they all work with, again, a core structured rules. I noticed that Simon Miller with Two of the Strongest, that he's approaching things actually in a very similar way as well. He's leapt over the Renaissance. He has it in the Civil War set. He has his Renaissance covered to a certain amount, but he's jumping over into sort of the later period, the 18th century. I'm working my way through time in a little bit more of a comprehensive way, perhaps. But again, these games are very different other than the fact that they both share a gridded playing surface. So as I say, the core rules are fairly generic, and we'll talk about the special rules just in a moment. So it covers the usual stuff, unit movement. Again, it is a gridded playing surface. You can see that in the background on the screen here. I've got some models sitting out here, some markers that we use in the game. Unit movement is certainly facilitated with the grid, but you do occasionally get into situations where you have a kind of an artificiality in the way that units move because of the gridded playing surface. So of course, like with anything, there are pros and cons, but I have to admit, this is the first game I've designed using a grid, and the benefits of the grid, I think, are pretty evident. Diagrams show you how the different unit types can move. And of course, that's textually obviously described as well. Diagrams also showing you certain prohibited moves. So again, hopefully clear and as concise as possible. I have to stress, this is not really meant to be a beer and pretzels game. And as my friend Artie Conliffe pointed out, even simple games often need a lot of words in order to clarify not only what is allowed, but what is not allowed. I've tried to write this in a fairly comprehensive, I shouldn't say fairly, in a comprehensive way, so that, every circumstance is covered. And of course, that's impossible. There is a small errata sheet being developed right now. But, fortunately, there haven't been too many problems reported, and the play testing was extensive over a number of years. So most circumstances were dealt with and have been dealt with in the rules. There is something I just want to make mention of very briefly. A lot of games have activation roles or cards or whatever it happens to be. And for games, especially setting one player against one player, I can see the reason for that, in so much that, if you're playing purely the commander-in-chief, your brigadiers, or whatever formation name you want to use, may not do what you want, or may do it, vigorously. And that's where the activation rules can come in and perhaps offer a sort of a sense of history in that way. This game takes sort of the opposite position. For one, even though it's absolutely playable one-on-one, in fact, it works really well. And in fact, there's a alternative turn sequence that really makes things quite interesting and random, especially for one-on-one games. The game really suits multiplayers or multiplayer games. And as a consequence, I did not want to use activation rules, because activation rules, unfortunately, has the effect of periodically having players do nothing. And frankly, if I want the randomness of, not knowing what a brigade is going to do, well, I only need to trust the, peccadillos of my dear friends who have certain styles of play and who will do sometimes kind of weird things. I don't need an activation system. But in contrast to that, I also think there is something else that is needed. And I think it's something that history really reveals of warfare generally, but especially, I think, pre-modern warfare. But as I say, I think it's actually true across the board. And that is, instead of worrying about whether units start movement, my concern in the game, and it's, I think, historically sound, is that once you've initiated forward momentum, and that's what this section is called, quite honestly, you have trouble stopping units. And so there is a section of the rules, again, called momentum, where once you initiate movement outside of your deployment zone, effectively once you're advancing against the enemy, there is that challenge of controlling that advance. And so you might find yourself unable to stop forward momentum. And that was an important aspect of the game. Another aspect of this, generally, again, depending on which turn sequence rules you use, but in the standard game, it's I go, you go. And as a consequence, you have to have evade rules. And I think those work really well. I've been very, very fortunate to have the friendship of Artie Conliffe. I helped work on a number of his games, Armati, Shaco, a little bit Crossfire as well. Through our conversations, especially about ancient medieval warfare, a lot of concepts, a lot of history and game design aspects were shared. And one of the things that sort of came out of that is how evade works. Usually evade is basically just to get light units out of trouble. But in this game, a game born of conversations with Artie, you can actually use light troops to slow the advance of opposing heavier troops. So light cavalry, they can't actually contact heavy cavalry, but if they're successful in their evade, they can cause the heavy cavalry, the enemy heavy cavalry, to move really at a very, very slow rate. Now, that's movement, unit reactions to combat. Very brief section here, but it's sort of a crash course in, before we get into combat, what happens to units when they suffer hits? And that's what this sort of couple of pages addresses. These rules are repeated in the specific sections of shooting and melee, but I wanted to summarize them here so that the concept is clear. At least I hope that that's the effect it has. Shooting, just a sort of a general statement about combat and the rules, again, without going into details. This is a sort of a small bucket of dice kind of game. You start with the unit's combat and control value, which is a very important number that's used for both combat, as you would expect, but also for all effectively morale tests, which are either control tests or catastrophe tests. And so that number is absolutely crucial. And there's really mostly just 3 of them: brittle troops, average troops, and tough troops. Brittle troops have 3, average troops have 4, and tough troops have 5. There are very occasionally units that are what I refer to as forgotten, basically forgotten in the record, who have a combat and control value of 2 dice. This would be like your peasant levy, very unmotivated troops. And even more rare, in fact, incredibly rare, are those troops that are legendary, that start off with 6 dice. This would be like, Alexander's companions. So, generally speaking, we start off with a group of dice. Here's your average unit of 4. And with whether it's shooting or melee, you either subtract or add dice based upon modifiers. Shooting modifiers are always negative, and there's a really simple design reason for that. I wanted to mitigate the effects of shooting, and so again, the modifiers are always negative in this game. This will change, by the way, in the Renaissance game, where shoot firepower becomes more important historically. And so you're adding and subtracting dice in melee. There may be sort of situations where a unit has shock, you add some dice. And doesn't matter how many dice you throw, doesn't matter what modifiers apply. Again, you're adding and subtracting dice. In combat, you need 4, 5s, and 6s to score hits. That's it. If you can remember that you need a 4, 5, or 6 in all combat situations, and the thing that's going to vary is the number of dice, you're off to the races. Combat is very simple. So that, as I say, applies to shooting and also in melee. There are some special rules for things like massed archery, which apply particularly and are important in periods such as the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, but might also apply to an ancient Indian or Persian army. Melee, once again, fairly straightforward in terms of the mechanics of melee. Again, rolling a small handful of dice and looking for 4s to 6s. The melee section starts actually with the charge rules, and most charges are actually quite straightforward. This is not a game where you engage, from a distance effectively and have to re-engage every turn. Once you're committed to melee and you are in effectively base-to-base contact, you're stuck in, unless you're cavalry fighting infantry who have the option of withdrawing if things are going poorly, for example. But once you're stuck in until that melee is resolved. All right. So melee results, once again, coming back to the effects of combat on units, which are summarized early on before the combat sections and are repeated again both in the shooting section and also in the melee sections. Melee results, exploitation, and tests. So here we have, okay, you fought the melee, you've perhaps won or lost. Now what do you do? And sort of typical of any of these games, because quite honestly, history demands that there be certain sort of commonalities between rule sets. Rule sets are effectively historical theses. We have, of course, control tests. We have We have pursuit tests, so units might pursue. That can often be fun. And we also have what's referred to, and of course you'll recall that the rules are called control to catastrophe. And catastrophe is a moment when a unit reaches a threshold and hits a hit trigger, as it's called in the game, and has to see whether they stay to fight. And this is a little unusual in the game compared to others where, in some games that we play, once you hit a certain threshold of hits, the unit automatically breaks. In Control to Catastrophe, this is simply not the case. The unit only breaks once it fails its catastrophe test. And here we are back again to that CCV number, the control, combat and control value. And so an average unit, for its control tests and its morale tests, if you will, the catastrophe tests, it has to roll below its CCV number, its combat and control value. And so it needs a 1, 2, or 3 in order to pass those tests. There are, of course, modifiers that affect that base number, but you're always trying to roll below it. And that might mean that your unit continues to fight, or with a failure, it might mean that it, of course, flees the table, is removed. Of course, brigades are vulnerable to the effects of combat on individual units within that brigade. So if you've got a number of units that have already suffered hits and have become what's referred to in the game as shaken, and then one of its neighboring units breaks and runs, it can have a cascading effect on other units in the brigade. Similarly, if a unit is broken and runs into any friend, it too can be swept away. This section actually is also about command and control. One of the reasons you need so many generals is that as units are lost, are broken and removed, it causes the brigade to which they're a part potentially to become splintered, broken apart, now into 2 or more, brigades effectively. And this is where you have to move that general figure, that command stand, and join it to one part that remains in command, and the other part or parts will, of course, become out of command and will need to roll to move. So in that respect, once you've lost control of parts of your brigades, they effectively do require an activation roll. Usual battlefield terrain, etc., etc. It includes all the bits and pieces that you'd expect, including camps, hidden movement, or hidden units rather, and a bit on hidden movement, a little bit on weather. And this is then that part of the rule set that I think is one of the more important things. The core rules are actually fairly straightforward in terms of both movement and combat. Where things become really interesting, I think, is when you get into these special rules. I think the basic game is fun for sure, but when you're deploying an army, for example, like a Roman army, this is where I think you need some nuance. If a Roman army just operates like any other army, if the units that comprise the legions just move around like any other unit, I think that really does this very sophisticated system a disservice. And so in Control to Catastrophe Caesar, there's actually extensive additional rules, special rules for the Romans. I think getting the Romans right in so much that we can, and historically there's still so many questions about how they operated, but getting them as right as possible, taking a stab at representing the multi-line system and all of that, I think is really important and speaks, I think, to the character of the army. So there's actually a few pages of rules for the Romans specifically. It seems a little daunting, but in fact, the system works very simply. And I'll do a video actually showing actually how the Roman system works. It is actually very straightforward, but what's exciting about it is that it presents a series of decisions that the Roman player has to make about when to push forward, the second or third line in their legion. And yeah, I think, as I say, it presents some interesting tactical opportunities. Again, special rules for special units, elephants, scythe chariots, these get some special mention, obviously. I didn't want to put elephants in the core rules because they're effectively a specialist troop type, and that's certainly true of scythe chariots. We have things for shield wall and stationary resilience of heavy foot. So armies, for example, like the Scots or the Fleming troops in the later Middle Ages. Then we have special rules as well for the English system of mixed units. I'm of the opinion that, for example, especially in the later Hundred Years' War and particularly in the Wars of the Roses, which we play quite a lot, that the units were not parsed out, that you don't have longbow units and men-at-arms, or billmen as they're often called, but that these units in fact operated together, and that at some point there was an exchange of ranks. And there's rules to represent that. Those longbowmen don't suddenly sort of, run off and prepare for a breakthrough to shoot those, victorious enemy to pieces. I think that they just simply were folded in to the melee troops. And I think that's true, actually, again, especially the later 100 Years' War. Again, don't want to go into a huge amount of detail. This video is probably already getting a little long. Special rules for the Swiss. Their halberd blocks, as I call them, and also, of course, ultimately the pike blocks. And given the fact that the rules basically go sort of at least to the mid-15th century, but frankly, you can play the Burgundian Wars, or Burgundian War, I should say, with Control to Catastrophe, and that's, of course, in the 1470s. So there's rules to address the pike block as well. This, of course, will move over into the Renaissance book and are developed a little further in that book. The other thing I included in this book is a fairly comprehensive handling of artillery, and it even actually makes reference of later artillery. I thought, given the fact that this is a family of rules, that I would include all those rules in this book, because, of course, by the 15th century, artillery is making a bigger impact, forgive the pun, on warfare. And so, effectively, you've got the full section of artillery rules in this book, even though the guns are primitive, compared to what they would become in the next book. But you've got all the artillery rules in here. War wagons, palisades, all of that is also covered. Finally, there's a short section of alternative or optional rules, including the alternative turn sequence, which I think is a lot of fun, and definitely moves away from the overall army move, counter move system. It's somewhat chaotic, but in fact, I would have used this as the core rules, but frankly, for large multiplayer games that I'm used to putting on, the White Rock Gamers includes about a dozen members. It doesn't work quite as well because there's a bit of waiting around while you move through the activated brigades. But I think it works really well for one or two players aside, and as I say, creates a far more chaotic, less chess-like game. There's some other rules here as well, some of which, as I say, I was torn about whether to put them in the core rules or not, but anyway, they're here. There's not many of them, so I don't think it's a problem. Finally, there's a section called Army Lists and Scenarios, and in that, I talk a little bit about my philosophy on army lists, which is not terribly favorable, but I know that army lists are a necessary evil for the hobby, especially these earlier periods, and I actually provide some sample army lists, just sort of jumping in and out of history. We start with sort of the Alexandrian period, so there's the Macedonian army list, there's the army list for the ancient Indians and Persians, and a scenario for the Battle of Hydaspes included in that section of lists. And finally, sorry, not finally. Then we go to the Punic Wars. I include the Romans and the Carthaginian lists and a scenario for the Battle of Trebia. A lot of fun, actually, that battle. I really enjoy that one. And finally, we have a medieval list, one of my favorites, the Wars of the Roses, with lots of special rules attached to that army list, and a scenario for the Battle of Tewkesbury, including, of course, a rudimentary map. So there it is, Control to Catastrophe Caesar. Have a look. It's available through Wargame Vault, and I have a website, Decisive Wargame Design. Thanks for watching. Take care.